Hey legends, Leslie from Essentially Active here, and today's video is a little bit different. I want to talk a little bit about what happens to our cells and a specific type of cell called, and forgive me, I've got a whole bunch of notes, so I might read a couple of words here and there. There we have a particular kind of cell called the adipogenic stem cells. Now, the importance of these stem cells are huge, right? Because these are the cells that, as stem cells, can be activated to become either fat cells, adipogenic, right, adipose fat. But these cells can also be activated to become muscle, different soft tissue, and bone, which is super cool. Now, it becomes a super important, relevant topic because we don't necessarily make more fat cells or more muscle cells or more bone cells, right? By the time we hit our early 20s, we've kind of made all our cells. But what happens is this constant cycle of cell renewal. So when cells go through their life cycle, they die and we make new ones. Now, whether we have bone, muscle, or fat, these adipogenic stem cells are the ones that replace the cells that die. So the particularly funky thing here, guys, is that we can start with lots of muscle mass, but we can have lifestyle factors that can influence that when that muscle cell dies, is that replaced by a muscle cell or a fat cell? Blows my mind to think about it sometimes. Now, the adipogenic stem cells, they can stay dormant, they can proliferate, or they can differentiate, right? And so the key thing is that we want these cells to differentiate into either bone or muscle cells more often than not, because we want to maintain muscle mass and we want to maintain our bone density. So if these stem cells are not becoming bone and muscle cells, we end up losing bone density or muscle mass. And all of those factors, or they become factors is a better way to say it, they become factors in terms of a whole bunch of chronic disease. We might be more prone to fractures. We might end up being more prone to things like type 2 diabetes because we don't necessarily have as much muscle to use the food that we're taking in. Okay, so the way that they differentiate are based on signals that are more often than not lifestyle driven. Now, this is called the signal transduction pathway. Now, how does lifestyle influence all of this stuff? So I'm going to go through a bunch of these factors. Now, excess calories, particularly from carbs, all carbs, like often people talk about it as sugar, but all carbs are sugar in the blood. And so what this will do is it'll raise insulin and certain lipids in our body. And this actually favors turning these stem cells into fat. So it favors fat storage. It also promotes what's called a PPAR mechanism, and this actually turns these fat cells on. So more likely when a fat cell dies, it will be replaced by a fat cell. Plus, if a muscle cell dies, it's probably going to be replaced by a fat cell. So what things also influence this? So obviously this is diet related at this point. So we've talked about excess calories, particularly from sugar, but it also is excess fat calories. So we want to make sure that we're getting good, yummy fats, of course. But here's the other kicker. We have a protein deficient or a low protein diet and a diet that is more ultra processed, i.e. it is deficient in our micronutrients. Now, this is going to bias these stem cells towards fat storage as well. And so this, ultimately what it does is it reduces our body's ability to build muscle mass and to maintain bone density. Now, how can we kind of counteract that? Things like polyphenols, can help reduce that new fat cell formation. There are certain essential oil blends that can help with that PPAR mechanism and switching that off so that we can kind of inhibit those cells from going down the fat cell trigger pathway. Now, what about exercise? Leslie, you run a lot, of course, exercise is a big deal. Yeah, it is, right? So the cool thing about exercise is that when we've got this whole stretch contract scenario within our muscle fibers, we have mechanoreceptors and they promote differentiation into bone or muscle cells. Basically, it's the stress on the muscle and the stress on the bone encourages that creation of new bone and muscle cells, which is super cool. So as you can imagine, a sedentary lifestyle does the opposite of that, right? It promotes the fat storage. Yeah, not so good. Now, something we don't talk about a whole heap is the impact of hormones on these processes. Now, the big one here is cortisol, because chronic cortisol being at a high level triggers fat creation. However, when we have shorter bursts of cortisol from exercise, it actually doesn't do that. So the key thing is it's okay to be stressed, but we've got to balance it all out. Of course, again, things like inflammation, they're going to trigger fat cells. If we've got systemic inflammation, it will promote these stem cells becoming fat cells. Now, when we reduce the inflammation, of course, we promote healthier stem cell behavior. And the cool thing, or the very interesting thing here, is like fat cells are a little bit like balloons, right? We can still have lots of them, but we can actually focus on less storage within them as well. So that's actually when we might get smaller, like waist diameters and things like that. So the key thing here is that we're not creating like more cells. We're never really creating more cells as such, right? But we're talking about cell turnover and how lifestyle can impact that composition of the differentiation of these adipogenic stem cells. Anyway, hope you found that super useful. If you did, drop a note in the comments and yeah, we'll keep going. Cheers.